So welcome everyone and to this talk by Jeremy. We're really honored to have Jeremy with us. I'm Isias Johannes. I curated together with Mariam and organized this Academia Commons talk. Academia is an online socio-ecological academy. Academia's aim is to support individuals and communities that are working to empower their communities and those who work for the planet. Academia aspires to build bridges between peoples from the northern and southern hemisphere through cooperation, collaboration, and educational programs. We try to bring ideas and concepts and models together on this platform. And with that, we hope to inspire a dialogue and build bridges between communities and individuals. Academia also offers scholarships to indigenous people and refugees, activists, and to those who cannot afford it to participate in the educational programs. So that's about academia, and our speaker today is Jeremy Lent, an author and a speaker who investigates the underlying causes of our civilization's existential crisis and explores pathways toward a life-affirming future. His award-winning book, The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning, examines the way humans have made meaning from the cosmos, from the times that we were hunter-gatherers to the present day. His new book, The Web of Meaning, integrating science and traditional wisdom to find our place in the universe, offers a solid foundation for integrative world that could lead humanity to a sustainable future. I would like to read a short piece that Fritjof Capra said about this book, which really touched us, inspired us. He says, Jeremy Lent is one of today's most eloquent cultural observers. In this captivating book, he addresses with frightening clarity how humanity's loss of balance within ourselves and with the natural world has brought civilizations to the brink of collapse. And he also shows us a way out, a path of integration, recognizing our deep interconnectedness that could lead toward a new ecological civilization. I highly recommend this book, this inspiring book, to anyone concerned about the future of humanity. Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Isaias. And yeah, I just love what you're doing with ECODEMIA, and it really feels like an honor to be able to contribute to this. So thanks very much, and to everyone who joined today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin giving like a presentation of what the themes are of this book, The Web of Meaning, and it'll sort of make sense as we go through. And then we're going to spend a few minutes in breakout groups and then join back for the whole group as a whole to be able to share whatever came up in those breakout groups, as well as ask me any questions or just engage in general conversation about the issues that arose. So that's how we're going to look at this session today. And then without further ado, let me actually share my screen and I'll take you through the presentation. So hopefully this should work without too much difficulty here. And hopefully now you can all see the full screen, and obviously somebody let me know if that's not the case, but I think we're good now. Okay, great. Well, so here we are. So the book and this presentation is really about the web of meaning, integrating science and traditional wisdom to find our place in the universe. And, some people might reasonably ask, well, why do we need to find our place in the universe? Don't we kind of know where we're at right now? And I think the best way to answer that is to just look at what is actually going on around us in the world. And oftentimes when I talk about climate breakdown, I talk about specific places, but there's been so much happening this year that, wherever you are in the world, what we're talking about with wildfires around different continents, just the floods that we're experiencing, the droughts, all of these things we're told, once in a 50-year event happens multiple times every year now. And most of us know at this point that the reason is that we're facing a climate emergency. And that at the rate we're going right now, we're headed for what's been described by sober-minded climate scientists as a catastrophic increase in temperatures of 3 to 5 degrees Celsius this century. Even if we were to sort of get a little bit smarter and bring it down a little bit, even 2 degrees has been called a prescription for disaster. Even 1.5, which is the very best we can hope for, is itself not a safe target, but certainly better than anything else. But here's the thing, we're also aware about climate breakdown. But the fact is, even if we could somehow, by some sort of magic bullet, just kind of fix the climate problem itself, there is so much greater ecological devastation that we're doing that really the climate emergency itself should almost be seen more as a symptom of a much greater problem. And so if we expand out in terms of, again, what is our place in the universe, just looking at the Earth itself, here we are, just this beautiful planet in the middle of a universe which, as far as we know so far, we're the only planet that we know of that actually has life on it. And that life has been around on this planet for billions of years. And it's only been the last really 100,000 years or so that a species emerged that somehow managed to take so much control over the whole, over this whole living system itself. And then we can ask ourselves, well, what have we done with that control? And the sad, the wrenching, tragic answer is that we've been causing vast ecological destruction across the board. There's been, believe it or not, a 68% decline in animal populations in the world just since 1970 alone. We've now initiated, if we don't change our ways, the 6th great extinction of species since life began on Earth. And the other extinctions, of course, were caused by natural events. This is the only one caused by one species that knows what it's doing. And even if things began to improve, we're almost certainly looking at the virtual annihilation of coral reefs worldwide this century. And the UN forecasts that by the middle of the century, 95% of Earth's land will be degraded. But here's the statistic that actually blows me away more than any other, maybe, is that by 2050, at the current rates, there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish. So how did we get to this place? Well, some scientists who have studied what's been going on have looked at what's happened in human activity on the Earth just this century, really taking off since after the Second World War, and they call it the Great Acceleration. And if you look just at this slide for a moment, you can see why that is. In almost every level of activity, there's just been this explosion in the last few decades. And what is terrifying when you look at those statistics we were just looking at right now is that all this destruction that's happened right now at the current rate of consumption, and yet under mainstream forecasts, we're expected to triple the global gross domestic product, all the stuff that's produced and consumed by the middle of this century. So it's not surprising that it seems like we're actually rapidly heading for a precipice. As some great earth scientists have studied what they call our planetary boundaries. And they've like basically warned that we're already broken about 4 of those safe boundaries for what they call the safe operating space for humanity on Earth, which has led to all these kinds of major warnings from world scientists saying soon it'll be too late to shift course away from our failing trajectory. Another one, Hans Schellenhuber, says there's a very big risk we will end our civilization if we continue down this current path. And even the ex-UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon spoke to world leaders saying this is a global suicide pact. So how did we get to this place? Well, as Isaias was mentioning earlier, I wrote this book a few years back called The Patterning Instinct, a cultural history of humanity's search for meaning, which looked at the different ways in which cultures made meaning out of the universe, from all the way from hunter-gatherers to the present day. And it looked at how we actually got to this place we're at right now. And one of the major lessons that I learned from the book that kind of came out of that book is quite simply this, that culture shapes values, and those values shape history. And by the same token, it's our values now that will shape the future. So what are our values right now in our dominant mainstream worldview? Well, they're basically values based on separation, just like in this picture. Everyone is connected with their technology, separate from each other, separate even from the source of the food they're eating. They won't even think about where it came from. And this worldview of separation has like a sort of implicit story attached to it, which basically goes something like this, that nature is a machine, that humans are separate from nature. In fact, humans are separate from each other, that human progress arises from the conquest of nature. And the earth itself is really just a resource to exploit for human benefit. And really underlying all this is the sense that the purpose of life itself is essentially from this to just get wealthy and powerful. So in this most recent book that I wrote, it just came out a couple of months ago, called The Web of Meaning, what I'm showing is that modern story of separation, every one of those elements of it are actually false. They're not just dangerous, leading us down the wrong path to destruction, but they are just plain wrong. So in this book, I actually integrate both what the findings of modern sciences like neuroscience, complexity science, evolutionary biology, and system science with some of the great insights from traditional wisdom over the millennia, from indigenous knowledge, Taoism, Buddhism, and show that all of these insights from modern science and traditional wisdom point to the same underlying understanding of our intrinsic interconnectedness. And so as we delve into what that's all about, we're going to do it by looking at some of the big existential questions that pretty much every human asks at some point in their life, even if it's not as explicit as this. But these are questions we all ask. Who am I? Where am I? What am I? How should I live? And ultimately, why am I? And in each of these, we're going to look at what our modern dominant worldview tells us, show that that's wrong, and look at the potential for exploring a different way of answering these questions that could lead to a very different outcome for our lives and for our whole global society. And that's actually how the book itself is structured, according to these big existential questions. So let's begin with this first one. Who am I? Well, nowadays, most of the way in which we think of who we are comes from what's probably the most famous quote in philosophy that got stated by René Descartes back in Europe in the 17th century, who gave this famous quote, "I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum." And that's got it taken as the basis for understanding identity, which basically says that human identity exists solely through our conceptualizing faculty, which means that it's our that animals and our bodies are really just mere machines. And if our identity is just through our conceptualizing, and animals don't do that, and even our bodies don't do that, that means they don't have the same identity that we have. But in fact, what modern scientists have shown is that animals are most definitely not just machines. They have this deep intelligence. And elephants can communicate over hundreds of miles through infrasound with other communities. They perform ceremonies over dead family members. Dolphins and whales can talk to each other in local dialects. They call each other by name. They even gossip about those that are temporarily absent. We see wolves showing deep family commitment, with males helping to raise the young carefully until they reach maturity. But then even if we look outside these very sort of high-functioning mammals, even to plants, what we now discover from science, that plants themselves have a profoundly networked intelligence, like it's a distributed intelligence that they have. And plants have up to 20 different senses with which they sense the environment. They act intentionally, purposefully. They actually learn and have memories, and they communicate with each other. And the biologist Suzanne Simard has discovered what she calls the wood wide web, where the plant roots network in a forest you actually connect with a mycorrhizal fungal network to communicate with trees all over the forest and even allocate resources as a community. And here's what's so amazing, that what scientists have discovered when they've got even looking at the microscopic life of a single cell, that every single cell has an awe-inspiring intelligence of its own, with thousands of sensors and proteins sending and receiving hundreds of different signals. As each cell is aware of itself and others, it knows what to do. Cells will cooperate in community, and they'll even make decisions as a group. And what's amazing, of course, is that we have about 40 trillion of each of these cells within each of our bodies. So that's this deep intelligence of nature out there and within us. Now, this is something the modern science is only beginning to grapple with, to understand, but it's an overall intuition and understanding that other cultures have had for millennia. In particular, if we look back in ancient China at Taoist thought, we see this deep understanding of this kind of deep intelligence within nature. Many of you are going to be familiar with this book, the Tao Te Ching, which is the sort of great classic of Taoism and translates as being like the classic of Tao and De. And Tao, some of you will know already what that means. It basically means like the way or the path, the sense of how the forces of nature manifest in the world. And this word De is also very interesting. It refers to the spontaneity, the intrinsic nature that exists inherent in all living things. And when the Taoists looked at the world around them, outside of humans, they recognized that there was a state of acting in that state of De, that inherent power, that they called Wu Wei, which they kind of really, we can understand as being like effortless action. And they saw all non-human organisms acting naturally in this Wu Wei, this effortless action. But when they looked at us as humans, they realized that wasn't the case with us. So what happened to humans? Well, they saw that there's this one way of being really connected with the Tao, with Wu Wei, but the humans had seemed to have developed another way of living in the world that they called Yu Wei, which refers to purposive action. And they described it things like using a fire to dry up a well, or forcing water uphill to irrigate a mountainside or whatever. It's like going against the flow of nature. And of course, we might say, well, isn't that what humans do? Isn't that what civilization is all about? And the Taoists said, yes, exactly. And they kind of developed a theory of civilization based on that. And they look back at the earliest days, and they said that in the very earliest times, people belong to the whole world in what they called a state of perfect unity on terms of equality with all creatures, like forming one family. But then they said what happened was there was this shift that happened, and people began with civilization to get suspicious, and with ceremonies they began to be separated from one another with their machines. And what's so interesting is that now modern neuroscience has kind of validated their understanding of what they call this U-way cognition. We now know from modern neuroscience that humans have developed a very advanced prefrontal cortex that is what mediates our symbolic thought, our conceptualizing, planning, creating abstractions. And our cognitive anthropologists, when they look at the early ages of humanity, have also validated this Taoist theory of civilization. They've seen that it was with the rise of symbolic thought that humans developed things like language and culture, art, and tool making. So we can now understand that we have it like a dual human consciousness, that part that Descartes thought was that I think, therefore I am, is one aspect of it. It's what we can call conceptual consciousness, analytic, slow, rational, effortful, what the Taoists termed Yue. And also, we have the same animate consciousness that we share with all of life around us, that's intuitive, fast, emotional, effortless, which the Taoists called Wu Wei. So now we can begin to understand that we're actually an integrated organism, and that our challenge as humans is to really integrate both of those systems in harmony, not just identify with the one like Descartes did. So when we go back to this first question, who am I? We can now begin to see ourselves as, well, maybe I'm a mind-body organism that's capable of integration. So now let's turn to this second question. Where am I? And again, if we look at what our mainstream world tells us, it tells us that actually we live in a split universe. That there's this kind of a split between the material world below and some sort of transcendent space, where there's some kind of God that comes from a dimension that's separate from that material world. And in modern times, we're told that religion and science exist and should exist in different domains. So there's religion up there that relates to that source of transcendence, and there's science below. But that split sense of a universe is also what's led to our unsustainable worldview, where people feel that it's okay to pray to this God up there in the heavens, even while they're ransacking nature below. But even though we are told by so many different sources that we live in this split universe, that's not how other cultures actually made sense of the universe. And again, if we look back at ancient China, we see about 1,000 years ago, during what's called the Song Dynasty, a fascinating development of what of a group of thinkers that called themselves the School of the Tao. And this group of sages integrated three of the great traditions of thought that had evolved in China over millennia. There was Taoism, there was also Confucianism, and there was also Buddhism that started in India, but had been so inculcated in China by about 1,000 years ago that the Chinese kind of viewed it as just part of their own. But these sages in this time developed this way of thinking that they called Neo-Confucianism, or like we know as Neo-Confucianism today. And what's so fascinating is the way in which they integrated these ideas, because for the Neo-Confucians, they saw the entire universe as consisting of qi, like which we can think of from nowadays terms of like matter and or energy, and also li. And they called li the principles by which the qi is connected. So the forms of interconnection between all that matter and energy. And when they looked at those interconnections, they saw the totality of all the li in the universe as what they can understand as being the Tao. And here's the thing, when we look at modern systems science right now, that also points us to that same kind of connected universe. Whether we're looking at complexity science, systems biology, or chaos theory, all of these sciences tell us that everything is connected and in non-linear ways. So there was this famous question that Edward Lorenz, the founder of chaos theory, asked some decades ago, saying, is it possible that the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil could lead to a tornado in Texas because of this complex, interconnected, non-linear system that we all live in? And what scientists have begun to understand, just like those Neo-Confucians understood a millennia ago, was that the interactions between things often tell us more about them than the things themselves. So whether we're looking at the flocks of starlings in the sky, or shoals of fish in the sea, or even the ripples on sand dunes, or the whole global Earth system, or even looking outside of the Earth into galaxies, it's oftentimes the ways in which they interact that are more important than just the stuff themselves. And that's hard sometimes for us to get our heads around. And because we don't think of things in this way in our modern mainstream worldview. So I'm going to ask you for just a moment to kind of maybe even close your eyes for a moment and think of a photograph of yourself when you were a little child. Here's one of me when I was a kid. Now, when you think of that picture of yourself when you were a little child, you know that's you, right? I know that's me. I even have the memories to prove it. But what's so fascinating is virtually none of the cells that were in that little boy are in me now. And even the cells that stay in us through our entire life are always changing their configuration. So I can be virtually certain that there's not a single molecule that was in that little boy that's in me now. So what connects me to that little boy? Not the stuff that little boy was made of, right? What connects me to that little boy is those patterns of organization between those cells and those molecules that actually remain actually more resilient and more meaningful than the stuff themselves. Just like essentially the Lee in that little boy is the Lee that's in me today as it's evolved. And then when complexity scientists look around at nature, they see very important principle about the way these patterns all connect up, that they connect up in fractal ways. A fractal, as you may already know, is a pattern that repeats itself at different scales. It indicates self-organized activity, and it's everywhere in the natural world. We see it in coastlines, in leaves, in lightning, in lungs. We see it in neurons. And what scientists have begun to see is that nature itself, all the way through, is a fractally connected system, so that every cell is organized according to similar principles of each organism, which the cell's part, which is then part fractally of a species, which is then a fractal part of an ecosystem, which is then a fractal part of the living earth. So then, now, if we begin to look deeply at this question, where am I? Rather than just seeing ourselves as living in this split universe that we're told by mainstream thinking, we can now begin to explore what does it mean to realize that I am part of a fractally connected, self-organized universe. So with that understanding, let's move on to this next question. What am I? Well, one of those Neo-Confucian sages from 1,000 years ago, his name was Chu Shi, and he had this great statement. He said, if one wishes to know the reality of Tao, one must seek it in one's own nature. And if we ask about our own nature, but now we look to our mainstream worldview, well, what we're told by most sort of quasi-scientific stuff out there is that actually what we are, in the words of Richard Dawkins, who wrote this book, The Selfish Gene, that is one of the most dominant ways of understanding our a sort of quasi-science that goes around today. He says, we and all other animals are machines created by our genes in a highly competitive world. And because of this selfishness of the gene, a predominant quality to be expected in a successful gene, then, he says, is ruthless selfishness. And not just Richard Dawkins, but the thinking around that has led the common mainstream understanding of the gene as being the fundamental unit of evolution. We're told that the gene dictates everything about the organism and that it is inherently selfish and competitive. That's what we think is what science tells us. But actually, modern findings in biology, in evolutionary biology, cellular biology, systems biology, has shown each of those statements to actually be false. We now know that the gene, rather than being this sort of mechanistic thing that dictates everything about the organism, is actually part of an iterative process with the cell of which it's part and with the organism of which that's part, creating like this vibrant, dynamic, circular flow of interactivity. And biologists now have begun to see the genotype as being really more like an artist's palette. It's like a repertoire of capabilities that the cell can select based on its particular needs as determined by the environment. It's a very different picture. And one way of getting a sense of that is to just look at this as an example. Like most of us, we know what a grasshopper is like, this gentle, solitary creature. And then we know that locusts, very different, right? They're these aggressive swarms that will multiply in massive communities and like destroy like millions of acres of land oftentimes. It turns out that the grasshopper and the locust have exactly the same DNA. And the organism itself, each grasshopper itself, switches on and off certain genes within the genotype at certain times to actually turn into a locust. What a powerful example that is. But what about the selfishness? Maybe our organism's just selfish, just like those genes are. Well, it turns out when evolutionary biologists now understand how life evolved over these last billions of years, that the great steps in evolution to the abundance of life we have on Earth today, from single cells to complex cells to multicellular life to simple animals, each of these steps were actually the results of increases in cooperation. Life actually evolved its richness through cooperation. In the words of the biologist Lynn Margulis, life did not take over the world by combat, but by networking. And that's led to this incredible richness of the abundance of life we have around us right now. And the key to this networking is what's known as mutually beneficial symbiosis. It's like this harmonic dance of life, where all the different organisms actually relate to other organisms in ways that help themselves and help the others. Plants photosynthesize, provide nourishment, insects pollinate, animals transport the seeds and they fertilize the earth. The fungus regenerates all the dead matter and then even offers these mycorrhizal networks to transport nutrients for the plants who give themselves life. So this is what we actually see in life around us right now. And then we can begin to recognize that organisms themselves, including us, are self-organized, fractal, dynamic patterns. In the words of one biologist, Cole Woos, they're resilient patterns in a turbulent flow. And he says, it's become increasingly clear to understand living systems in any deep sense, we have to see them not as machines, but as stable, complex, dynamic organization. And it's that's led to this incredible fractal cascade of abundance that we get to enjoy in the world today. So now when we ask this question, what am I? We can use this understanding to see that, well, actually, I am a resilient pattern of self-organized cooperation with all of life around me, which leads naturally to ask ourselves, well, how should I live? And if we begin once again with what our dominant culture tells us, it's pretty simple, right? That humans are intrinsically selfish and greedy, that selfish behavior by individuals in the best interest of everyone is what we're told. And those famous words from that movie Wall Street by Gordon Gekko, as he says, greed is good. And that's how we should live. And that's what the neoliberal ideology that has dominated our world for the last few decades tells us should be the fundamental basis of our ethics. And even those who disagree with that neoliberal ideology still believe that there's something fundamentally selfish and competitive we have to overcome. So to his credit, Richard Dawkins, for example, doesn't believe in that neoliberal ideology. But even he says we have to try to teach generosity and altruism because we're born selfish. We have to understand what those selfish genes are up to so we can upset their designs. But what biologists, anthropologists have come to understand is that the opposite is true. Actually, humans evolved to be cooperative. When early humans diverged from when early prehumans diverged from other hominids millions of years ago, they were vulnerable to predators in the savannah they found themselves in. And what they learned is that those who learned to collaborate the best were the most successful. And so the identity of human beings gradually expanded to go from self to kin to include the entire group. And the human ability to cooperate with each other, even those who are not kin, is actually what differentiates us from other primates. So over those millions of years, humans developed what are called moral emotions, such as compassion, guilt, shame, gratitude, embarrassment. These felt deep within us, and they cause us to act in moral ways. And so we don't just act morally because we think we should, because society tells us it should be according to this or that values. We do so because it feels right to do so. Now, indigenous cultures around the world have always had this deep understanding of that. In Africa, there's this profound concept called Ubuntu, which is a community-based source of values, which roughly translates as I am because you are. In North America, we see, for example, the Lakota tribe have this phrase, Mitakuye Oyesin, which means we are all related. And they're referring not just to their own kin, but to all of life around them. So we can understand from this that flourishing itself is based on our intrinsic connectedness within ourselves, with those cells within us, with others around us, with the natural world, and with the entire living earth. And human flourishing itself, just like all these other systems we've looked at, is fractal. So each of our human mind-body organisms is part of a community, which is then part of the living earth. And one element within that, each of us as separate organisms, can only flourish as part of that overall greater flourishing of the larger community. So in the profound words of the humanitarian Albert Schweitzer in the 20th century, he saw this so deeply, and he stated at one point, I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live. And as the result of that, he said, I cannot but have reverence for all that is called life. That is the beginning and foundation of morality. So that helps us to answer this question now. How should I live? I should live in reverence and care for all life. And so let's just turn now to this final question. Why am I? And again, if we look at what our mainstream dominant culture tells us, it's pretty simple. It says there is no why. We live in a pointless universe. These are the words coming from the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Steven Weinberg, one of the sort of major voices of what's called reductionism or ontological reductionism. He said, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. But if we begin to look at meaning itself as being a function of the connectedness that we've just been exploring in the universe, we get to see that as the numbers of connections increases in any system, they lead to a phase transition and the emergence of new meaning. And we see this in all kinds of systems around us. Like, look at language. When words connect, language emerges. When organisms connect together, an ecosystem emerges. When neurons connect, consciousness emerges. And many of us have probably had some kind of peak experience of this sense of this deep connectedness, this emergence of meaning of all of life, and realizing that we are part of something so much bigger. And we're often told, well, that's great, but of course it's got nothing to do with science. That's something to do with spirituality, separate from the scientific understanding of the universe. But now we can get to understand that actually those peak experiences of oneness actually give us the insights into what science actually tells us is the underlying reality of our universe. And that deep sense of connectedness has profound implications, that everything you do in your life creates those Li ripples which affect everything else in the universe, leading to this deep principle of the ultimate connectivity of everything in the universe. So we begin to realize that we exist in an ocean of Li, and those Li ripples exist within each of us. And the choices we make, the personal choices and actions, choices to participate in regenerative community, choices to engage in the broader political process, each of those choices are what ultimately weave the web of meaning that we're embedded in. So now when we begin to ask that question, why am I? We can begin to explore what it might mean to say, well, perhaps I am here to weave my part in the web of meaning. And perhaps if enough of us can actually weave that connected web together, maybe we can actually help to regenerate this beautiful, fragile earth that is under so much destruction right now from this old worldview of separation. So this is what I describe in this book, The Web of Meaning. There's the two different covers. One is available in the USA and Canada, and others in the UK and Commonwealth. So you might see it by either of those covers. But now I'd like to pause. And before I leave the screen, I'm going to just show you this question. I'm going to ask each of you to reflect on, maybe for a couple of minutes, and then we'll move into breakout groups to actually share your thoughts about this question with others, and then we'll regroup as one. So here's this question now arising from this talk today. Where are the opportunities in my own life to weave my part in the web of meaning? So thanks for that. So now I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, are we back in full regular non-screen sharing mode at this point?
Yes. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for this inspiring talk.
Great.
That was
well,